It is my very great pleasure to welcome all of you to the National Endowment for Democracy for this very important conversation about very difficult issues like forced and child labor, and the very hopeful subject of what will be the next phase of the Cotton Campaign's critical work. It's actually wonderful that everybody's gathered here. Since 2007, the Cotton Campaign has been really at the forefront of the fight against state-imposed forced and child labor in the cotton industries of Uzbekistan and Turkmenistan. And the Endowment has been very proud to be a partner in this work since, I think, 2015, if I remember correctly. And really, the Cotton Campaign gathers its tremendous strength from the breadth and diversity of its coalition, which includes trade unions, human rights organizations, responsible investors, brands, and retailers. And I think we have been extraordinarily grateful that the campaign has been able to pair the endowment's civil society partners from Uzbekistan and Turkmenistan with business and labor stakeholders in the international community to bring the Uzbek government to the negotiating table. The endowment applauds the Cotton Campaign for its continued fight against forced labor and use of the broader movement to advocate for fundamental rights for all Turkmen and Uzbek citizens, including freedom of association. It's really showing, frankly, that solidarity and multi-stakeholder coalitions really can achieve progress in even the most closed environments, and that's quite an accomplishment, so well done. I think from our perspective, the effort is really at a critical point when it needs more donors to work actively with Uzbek and Turkmen civil society to continue to move the ball forward. I think the endowment is looking forward to continuing to work with the Cotton Campaign to parlay its great successes thus far into further gains for civil society and human rights in Uzbekistan and Turkmenistan. I'm conscious, actually, I'm thinking about our next speaker, of this idea that there is so much strength in having the right kind of broad and diverse coalition. And for us in the NED family, I think that the visionaries who created NED really, and willed it into being, really understood that there was sort of alchemistic potential, right? Like magic to be had if you gathered the right diverse set of players. So inside of the NED family, we have the International Republican Institute, the National Democratic Institute, the Center for International Private Enterprise, and the Solidarity Center. And putting us all under one roof, I think, was sort of a visionary, alchemistic idea. And so from within this family, it is my great pleasure to hand over to someone that I think is both wise and principled as she leads the Solidarity Center. And she's a really dynamic force in the work around this issue set. So with that, Shauna.
All right, thank you. I see so many people I haven't seen in a long time. More. Great to be with everyone today. And first, I'm having terrible allergies, so forgive me on the coughing and this thing. Maybe some of you are like me in that regard. So, okay. Thanks to the NED. Thanks, Kirsten, for the introduction. Thanks for hosting us. This is a really special occasion. This event is really, what does winning look like? I was earlier, just 5 minutes ago, talking to Bennett Freeman about just how rarely we get to even, we always envision the win, but actually kind of get close to there. There's always more work to do. But I think this particular campaign and the coalition that was a part of driving this change is something to really spend a good deal of time thinking about, looking at, investigating, and figuring out how we replicate it, because we have so many challenges to labor rights, human rights, and democracy around the world that really could benefit from this type of campaign and structure. So I just wanted to start by saying this is a great occasion. The Solidarity Center is, has been a part of the Cotton Campaign from the very beginning, and we've been really honored to be on a team with ILRF over the years, International Labor Rights Forum, JJ Rosenbaum, the executive director of Global Labor Justice, ILRF as it's now known with the great campaigners from that team who were steadfast over many, many years, despite enormous pressure to continue leading this campaign to success. It's really hard to underscore how innovative the campaign structure was for its day when it was launched in the beginning. People weren't talking about supply chains and the accountability of corporations to human rights across their supply chains when this campaign was launched, and not nearly in the way they are today. And the idea that you would bring together international labor organizations, like you'll hear from today, with global business and civil society in common cause was also extremely uncommon for the time. So the vision was big. The goal was important, the eradication of the worst forms of child labor in Uzbekistan, which at the time included children and adults, and then later included adults, and now is diminishing, which is a wonderful, absolutely fantastic outcome. So when we start to think about the supply chain of international business and the sourcing of cotton, but there are many other supply chains to think about. It really does call to question in 2023, in a time of enormous challenges to democracy and human rights around the world, with resurgent authoritarianism, with more and more rollbacks on democracy and human rights and fundamental human freedoms around the world. It really does call into question the role of international business and the role of companies and what role companies can play in being a positive force for the advancement of human rights. And this campaign is a really good example of how that worked. We are very clear that a missing voice on the international advancement of democracy and human rights is, in fact, very often multinational business. The idea that a lead, like a company based somewhere that is sourcing from somewhere else, has no responsibility to the workers in that other place, that's down the supply chain, that's somebody else's trouble, that's someone else's business, is in fact not acceptable today. If you're an international business, you are stuck with the democracy issues from Uzbekistan to China to Mexico and everywhere else, because they're front and center. And companies have a critical role to play in saying that human rights standards are meaningful in our business model, are meaningful in the outcomes that we're looking for, and you don't get a pass just because you're in the private sector. None of the companies that worked on this campaign took a pass. They showed up, they fought, and at times when even sometimes maybe our own government was asking the Cotton Campaign to loosen up or lighten up a bit. In fact, the Coalition of Business, Labor, and Civil Society never said yes to that, and that was really important. And I think has lessons for the fights we have coming forward around the world for the advancement of human rights and democracy. I definitely think that, we have an enormous thanks we need to give to the National Endowment for Democracy. It wasn't just any funder that stepped in and supported the Cotton Campaign. The staff of the NED and the leadership of the NED understood that forced labor is not just some side labor issue, that the issue of forced labor in Uzbekistan was actually fundamental to human dignity, questions of human dignity, equity and fairness for people, and that those questions, equity, fairness, and dignity, are fundamental to building a community of practice, a political and development scene in a country that is responsive to its citizens and that leads into a more democratic and open society. So it was quite critical, important, and visionary of the NED to jump in and support this work, which is a little outside of what the NED does. The NED is not really a forced labor and child labor operation, but they saw the connection to democracy here, as we do. And we were extremely glad for that. With the progress that's been made, and you'll hear amazing speakers talk about that progress and the opportunities now, we really would just briefly lift up the absolutely tremendous leadership in Uzbekistan of incredibly brave people, citizens who took enormous risks, many of whom paid incredible prices for speaking out, for documenting forced labor, for speaking out against forced labor, and for working in these coalitions and trying to envision something more beautiful and more tremendous that was possible for their nation. And so a global campaign has the privilege and honor of being in support of the goals of the people of Uzbekistan who led that fight and helping amplify their voices. And we know that in Turkmenistan, we have much more to do. We still have a huge problem right next door with forced labor, and there's a big role for all of us there. It's really critical to mention that as we make advancement in Uzbekistan, and the government is making really good efforts to advance rights in this sector more broadly, that we remember there's still a lot of work to be done. And we continue to be missing, and we are working collectively to get in this new phase of this work, the rights of all workers in Uzbekistan to form unions and build towards collective bargaining and advocacy and tripartite dialogue and advocate with their own, hopeful, as the country continues to move forward, advocate on behalf of workers at the national level. That is still a huge goal, and that is a primary focus of many of the people in this room moving forward. I would close with one of the more exciting things to come out of the Cotton Campaign is this new phase of the campaign, which you'll hear today from people describing the opportunities now. And one of them being, we have been able for the first time coming out of the campaign as Solidarity Center to partner directly with the Center for International Private Enterprise on a new program that our own Department of Labor is in fact supporting, since they've also seen the value and importance of this work. And we're really hopeful that that'll help lay a good foundation for the future. So I really appreciate the opportunity to be here today, to be a part of this event. And I am really honored to now get to turn this over to we say sister in the labor movement, we're not nuns, my sister, JJ Rosenbaum, who is the executive director of Global Labor Justice, ILRF. And she's gonna let me say this for 1 second. JJ is a really critical leader in the global work to hold companies accountable to the eradication of forced labor in their supply chains. Her work has been extremely impactful in the United States context, where she has done critical work on forced labor here, in Mexico, in Taiwan, in India, and now really critically, clearly over many years in Uzbekistan, where ILRF was played a leading role. So I don't want to lose this moment to not say that JJ is a real important leader in this space globally, and it's an honor to turn the mic to her. So thank you.
And at this point, I'm actually going to introduce General Secretary Sue Longley of the IUF. Another beautiful thing about this campaign is there are a lot of great women that have been at the helm of it, and some dudes too, but a lot of great women, and Sue Longley is among them. She's the General Secretary of the International Union of Food, Agricultural, Hotel, Restaurant, Catering, Tobacco, and Allied Workers Associations. We call it the IUF. It has 407 affiliates in 126 countries and over 10 million members. And they say that they fight and win for workers across the food chain, from fields to factories to hotels, restaurants, and fast food chains. So just imagine all of those ways that you touch those sectors. The IUF is there, and its members and its unions are a part of that all around the world. Sue is the first woman to lead the Federation as the General Secretary, and she comes out of the agricultural sector and the IUF has been an important partner in this campaign from the beginning. She wasn't able to join us today, so we have brief pre-recorded remarks. Thanks.
Dear friends and colleagues, I'm sorry I can't be with you today to join this important event to mark 15 years of the Cotton Campaign. The Cotton Campaign has shown what can be achieved when we come together in effective broad coalitions to fight for rights. The campaign led the fight to end forced and child labour in Uzbekistan and must take all credit for that achievement. Yet there are still many battles to fight. We all take cotton for granted, yet we know that behind its production are many horror stories, many rights abuses. So much work to be done in Turkmenistan, in the Uyghur region, and also to ensure that cotton's environmental impact is reduced. So I look forward to another 15 years of the Cotton Campaign, working together to make sure that cotton is sustainable for the workers and farmers producing it, and also for our environment. Wishing you a very successful event today. Thank you.
So I'm really, it's really my honor to welcome everyone here today on behalf of Global Labor Justice International Labor Rights Forum, long name, labor in the center, that's how we say it, and to really speak on behalf of work that was begun by previous women leaders of the ILRF, including Judy Gearhart and Bama Arthrea, who are still in the movement with us now, and which is currently led by an amazing team within our organization, including Allison Gill, without whose work this campaign would not be moving forward in the way that it is, as well as Raluca, I hope can raise her hand wherever she is, and Rebecca and Danny, and a great women-led team internally here. Over the next few hours, you're going to hear from the founders, from partners, from allies, from supporters about what the Cotton Campaign has achieved and what lessons can we take from it, both into the context of Turkmenistan, but much more broadly. The ambition here is what can we take into many regions around the world? What can we take into different kinds of sectors? So I would like to make 3 points to kick us off. The first is that this campaign is grounded in the understanding that the fundamental antidote to forced labor is freedom of association and assembly and collective bargaining. The right to organize and make collective demands for change, including the right to register civil society organizations and to be a part of them, is fundamental. And another way to say this is that when you have decent work and you have protagonism of people in their workplaces, you will not have forced labor. And so I think we can learn a lot from the Cotton Campaign in that approach, which was also very novel for the time, and I hope in part because of the work of many people in this room and the Solidarity Center and others, is becoming more of the mainstream. Secondly, forced labor exists on a spectrum. It is not a bug that you stamp out with your shoe and then it is over. And there are many forces that lead to it. There are many root causes, and a campaign must have a multifaceted approach, a multi-stakeholders within it, and ultimately must continue to do the work even when we make significant gains to prevent that backsliding. We know that global supply chains have a problem generally with forced labor. Some people would say that they create forced labor by their structure. We don't have to all agree about that to be in the Cotton Campaign. But we have to know that as we move forward, it's going to continue to take monitoring and due diligence and labor agreements and all kinds of different efforts to make sure that the progress that we have won is continued and that the steps forward that the workers are demanding are able to continue. The third point and final point I wanted to make is, and I think Shauna also said this really importantly earlier, is that the Cotton Campaign shows that workers in every country in the world are demanding international labor standards apply to them in their own way, in their own culture, and that we can and should run campaigns like this to help deliver those international labor rights in every place. We cannot accept a world where there are some workers in some places for whom fundamental international labor standards do not apply. This campaign took that flag very boldly, and I think that it is a call to all of us to think about how we expand, where do we do this work, and to push back on anyone who says that there are some places where workers just don't need their rights or where they can wait another 10 years or 15 years or 100 years for labor rights to come to them. So you'll now hear from speakers about the real successes that have been achieved, the lessons that we've learned, and what's coming next. We're going to have a serious discussion about Turkmenistan because as we claim victory, we are not claiming conclusion. we are stepping forward, and we are really hoping that everyone in this room that has committed to the campaign in the past is re-upping their commitment in the next phase. We're also going to talk about what kind of formations will it take to hold the progress, and what roles do brands and clusters and unions and civil society organizations need to play. And we have some really interesting models from the adjacent garment sector and enforceable brand agreements in Bangladesh, in Lesotho, in India, and now in Pakistan. And there are ways to, I think, apply a lot of the learning from that in this campaign. So we're going to dig into that a little bit. And so in sum, thank you all for being here again. I think I'm going to pass now to the panel who will dig in and dive in. And just to say a special appreciation for those who are celebrating Passover today. We did understand and acknowledge that this is not an ideal day on the Jewish calendar or the calendar of those who are celebrating Ramadan. So we appreciate everyone who's made the special effort to be here today and the special gift that comes from us all being in the same room. Thank you.
And I would like to extend our thanks to everyone who has joined us today, and a thank you to our panelists for agreeing to speak about their experiences with the Cotton Campaign and share lessons learned and how to move forward. The Cotton Campaign asked me, and I'm happy to give a shout out to the Open Society Foundation, which provided crucial support in the beginning, both in terms of intellectual leadership, financial support, and guidance. So I don't think they're here with us, but their contribution to this campaign has been really crucial. As we are here to celebrate some of the successes and landmark decisions, we're looking to learn how it all came about, how it evolved over the years, and what are some lessons learned and how to move it forward for the future. Oh, now you can hear me, good. So without further ado, first on our panel list is Bennett Freeman, who, for those who are not aware, is a co-founder of the Cotton Campaign and a former U.S. Deputy Assistant Secretary for State for Democracy, Human Rights, and Labor. And if I can start you off with a question, Bennett, can you give us a brief background on how the Cotton Campaign started, how it evolved, and what has made it so uniquely successful?
That's a great question. Thank you for that. And just to be clear, I am the dude to whom JJ referred, but one of a few dudes involved for many, many years among great women. So, but you know, Nate Herman and Rudy and Ruslan and others, Alisher, who aren't with us, but a privilege to be the co-founder with Tricia Jurowitz and to work with so many wonderful women from Uzbekistan and the US and Europe and around the world. I think it's important to go back to 2007, 2008, when this campaign was conceptualized and launched, and to understand what a deeply, darkly repressive situation the people of Uzbekistan faced, and that we confronted in designing a campaign that could possibly ever lead to any kind of success. Uzbekistan had become one of the probably half dozen most repressive regimes in the world by the early 2000s, and missed the chance to evolve differently after Soviet independence in 1992. And forced labor was one of a number of features of this deep, dark repression, but at its height numbered a couple million people in the world, children, teenagers, students, adults, forced to pick cotton by hand in the fields without pay. It came down over the years by the mid-2010s to about merely a million, and I say merely sarcastically, a million people forced. And I can't emphasize enough how brutal the dictator, Islam Karimov, was until his death in 2016. So we were looking at a bleak situation. But resolved we had to do something, and we were often asked, why Uzbekistan? And the reason was that we confronted then the largest situation in the entire world of state-imposed forced labor. There's forced labor in dozens, over 100 countries around the world, but state-imposed forced labor on a scale not seen since forced collectivization in Stalinist Soviet Union or the Great Leap Forward under Mao in China, just absolutely grotesque. We decided we had to do something, and I want to emphasize two main themes here. First is the unusual, if not unique, multi-stakeholder coalition that Shauna has already mentioned. I'll elaborate very briefly on that. And then what I would consider the triad, the three legs of our strategy that led to success, at least in ending state-imposed forced labor. On the multi-stakeholder coalition, sure, we rounded up the usual suspects. NGOs, labor and human rights advocates, trade unionists, socially responsible investors. Terrific. It was still innovative what we imagined, even among the usual suspects. But we went immediately from the very beginning in early 2008 to the less usual suspects, to global apparel brands. And sure, we had to do a lot of work to get them aligned, and you're going to hear that from Patricia, who did more of that work to put together the pledge than anybody. But we had at the table, physically at the table, and with us politically and morally, beginning in 2008, some of the biggest apparel brands in the world. They showed up at meetings at the State Department, online, on calls, and they have been aligned with us ever since. And you know, Julie has been with us, 8 or 10 years. Nate Herman, I don't think, is with us this afternoon, but Nate from the very, very beginning. Merely the U.S. Fashion Industry Association and the American Apparel and Footwear Association. So this, I think it's an unusual and perhaps probably a uniquely successful multi-stakeholder coalition. And as Shauna rightly emphasizes, a real model for what business can do with civil society, with labor and human rights advocates, with responsible investors to tackle freedom of association and workers' rights around the world, and more broadly, civic space, shared space that should bring together civil society and business around the world in support of democracy, human rights, and labor rights. But the strategy, you know, I don't think that we consciously wrote it in 2008-9. It sort of emerged organically over the years, but we refined it, and it essentially boiled down to three prongs, three legs of a triangle, however you want to visualize it. But we had and each complementary, mutually reinforcing. We had diplomatic engagement with the Uzbek government that failed the first couple of years, revived quite successfully beginning in early 2018 after an interregnum of 8 years where we just didn't speak to each other. But diplomacy, not just with the Uzbek government, with the US government, with European governments, with the ILO, which had its twists and turns, but we were the ones who first proposed that the ILO go and do monitoring and technical assistance, and that did pay off. And so that was the first. But the second was the economic pressure through the boycott, the pledge. We called it the pledge. It was a boycott. And again, you're going to hear about the construction and implementation of that through Patricia, from Patricia. I mean, just an extraordinary effort. And it was that economic pressure that gave the diplomatic engagement the edge and the leverage and the impact. Once reform was announced and committed beginning in late 2017, it was then, when are you going to lift the pledge, the boycott? And our answer consistently was when you have eliminated state-imposed forced labor. And we held them to it. They put immense pressure on us collectively and individually, but we held through the harvest of 2021 until there was no trace of state-imposed forced labor, as verified by the Uzbek Forum for Human Rights and others. And then finally, and I mentioned the Uzbek Forum for Human Rights and others very deliberately, none of this would have happened. Not the campaign, the multi-stakeholder coalition, the diplomatic engagement, the economic leverage, had it not been for the steadfast support of Uzbek civil society on the ground ground and in exile. And you'll meet, for those who don't know you, Amita, one of the heroes of our time, on the next panel. But I can't emphasize enough how fearless and courageous civil society, a tiny sliver of embattled civil society on the ground, taking risks with their livelihoods, to do this work, to verify, to monitor, to verify in extraordinary circumstances of stress and duress every step of the way, and supported by Umida and her team from Europe and the rest of us. But this was an extraordinary convergence of that civil society support, the diplomatic engagement, and the economic pressure. So I'll leave it at that for now. Look forward to the rest of this panel and to the next panel, but I just want to say that we have much more work to do in Uzbekistan, on to Turkmenistan, and on to other huge challenges for workers' rights around the world, where we can, we must, and we will enlist business support with this cotton campaign of ours as a model and a blueprint. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Bennett. And now we will hear from Patricia Jurevic. I hope I pronounced that correctly. And she's the Cotton Campaign co-founder and is currently founder and CEO of the Responsible Sourcing Network. And if I can start off your remarks with a bit of a leading question, or two rather. Can you give us a sense of the role and importance of Uzbek civil society from the beginning, and how throughout the campaign over the past 15 years? And also, as Bennett mentioned, the Cotton Pledge was such an important tool. How did it come about, and what was its impact over the years in the beginning, and how it evolved towards where it is now?
Great, thanks, Spaska. And excuse me, I know that Bennett already set me up well for, but didn't take all my comments, so that's good. But to start with civil society, and of course, Gul knows here will be able to speak from experience because I can't. But what was really important was seeing some of the videos of school buses going out to the fields, and the photos, and starting to talk to companies about that, bringing those videos and those photos, to companies, and seeing the children in the fields, and they were just really appalled, and knowing that it was forced child labor. So not just child labor, not just forced labor, but the worst form of child labor, which is that forcing these young kids. We have photos of 7-year-olds in the fields, so that was really appalling. And then being followed up by an actual request for a boycott, because when we first started talking to companies, they're like, well, if we boycott, won't they be worse off? Won't the pickers, the farmers, et cetera, it's going to hurt their livelihoods. And it's like, they're the ones asking for it. This is not our idea to boycott. They want the boycott. The life is so terrible. We'll hear more about that. But they asked for it, right? So we could take that request to the companies, from civil society, and that was the impetus for why we wanted to create the pledge in the first place. But it was their courage in finding the information out, getting it to us. There's so many, different issues coming at us all the time. Back in 2007, it wasn't quite as much of a bombardment as today, because we're really seeing everything that's out there. But there was enough information for us to take that forward. And, Bennett gave some of the history there, and really starting to pull together then business with the socially responsible investors and human rights and labor rights organizations, so that we had, I think, our first multi-stakeholder meeting at GAP's headquarters, actually in 2008, starting to talk about what we could do. And so then out of that kind of collaborative discussion, out came the request to start telling your suppliers, having companies tell their suppliers not to source Uzbek cotton, and not to source from Uzbekistan. There were a couple of brands who had some production done, I think like children's pajamas or something like that, and they immediately stopped their orders. And I remember one of them saying, they were actually really nice clothes, and it was a hard decision, but we, were fully committed. And even I remember a year or two later, the factory came back and they're like, look, we're doing just-in-time delivery, we're doing all these great things. And the brand said, but what are you doing to address forced labor in the cotton field? And until you do that, we won't come back. And so, it was such a great story to bring that forward and say, look, see, business is actually very committed to not having forced child labor in their product. And then we saw the evolution of, okay, it's not those youngest children, but then the older children in the high school and the college. And then it wasn't the students anymore. Then it was the nurses and the teachers and the firefighters. So we have seen it. And, it is actually a little harder to show pictures of adults saying they're forced to work when children are definitely, they're like, how do you know they're forced to work? Or maybe they're not, but they were paid to replace somebody else because that person was being forced to work. So, all of that kind of all came together, and then the companies started to send these letters to their suppliers. And so the idea of the pledge was actually, well, we knew that those letters existed. They shared them with me, saying, okay, here's what we're telling our suppliers. And we said, well, maybe what we do is we kind of put them all in one place. Let's kind of come up with a pledge. It's not a super high bar, but it's a commitment not to source from Uzbekistan. And because companies don't buy cotton, right? They buy finished goods. So that means they have to actually pass that message through the multiple tiers of their supply chain until it gets to where the cotton is being harvested. But bringing all of that together, we said, well, what's important is that we have these commitments. And the companies they would post their own letters on their website or their own commitments, their own policies. But this was a way for us to bring it into one place because we wanted to let the government know these are all the companies that are committed to not sourcing cotton from Uzbekistan until that state-imposed systemic forced labor was eradicated. And I remember there were people who were like, oh, that pledge is so weak, that's not going to work, and we didn't have a ton of support for it. I think we did our first press release with 20 companies when Gulnara, the daughter of the then president, was supposed to be in the New York City fashion show, and we did protest outside her where she had her fashion show outside of the actual formal location. But we also then at that time issued the press release with the first 20 companies. And over the years, we just kept up the drumbeat, kept it up, so that now there's over 300 brands and retailers that have signed that pledge at the time we finally lifted it last year. So that's kind of the momentum of how it all grew. But I remember hearing from ILO and others saying, that pledge, that's actually really making a difference, and so we knew, and combined with the whole different strategies, that's really how we've been able to make a difference.
Thank you very much, Patricia. If you can just turn off the mic. Thank you. And next, we're actually very honored to have Gulnaz Mamarasulova. She's a labor rights monitor and a member of the Uzbek Forum for Human Rights, which is a key NGO who has been part of the Cotton Campaign on Uzbekistan. And Gulnaz, in many ways, your personal and professional journey really exemplifies how the Cotton Campaign works with activists and civil society groups in country. And it's been instrumental in providing information to the Cotton Campaign and also building up the capacity of activists such as yourself to provide both monitoring reports and contribute to international advocacy efforts. So if you can just talk a little bit about how did you become involved with the Cotton Campaign? You were forced in Uzbekistan to pick cotton as a student and later on as a teacher as well. So talk about your experiences and describe how the Cotton Campaign has really shaped your professional journey up to this point. Thank you.
Thank you, Spaska. I'm Gulnaz Mamarasulova. I'm based in Tashkent. I've been monitoring with the Uzbek Forum for Human Rights, a frontline partner of the Cotton Campaign, for almost 10 years. And I consider the Cotton Campaign and the Uzbek Forum for Human Rights to be brave organizations that work tirelessly to improve the lives of the people of Uzbekistan, to end child and forced labor in the cotton fields and free the Uzbek people from the curse of forced labor that they suffered for decades. In the first years when I started my monitoring child and forced labor in the cotton fields of Uzbekistan, was widespread, the systematic and government orchestrated. Every year at the beginning of the September, markets, schools and hospitals in Uzbekistan were closed in all regions, and signs saying all in cotton fields were hung on their doors. In September, Uzbek school children and the university students had to be in the cotton fields with their teachers for more than 2 months, depriving them of their education. The full impact of this dreadful policy on educational standards can still be felt today. Doctors and nurses were also forced to go to the cotton fields, endangering the care of the patients. The situation in state-owned organizations was equally dire, and employees who refused to pick cotton would face the pressures, the harassment, the threats of dismissal from their jobs, non-payment of salaries, and problems with their boss. Farmers, on the other hand, were obliged to take the certain number of pickers to the fields to meet cotton quotas set by the state. Otherwise, they would come under pressure from the tax or the government authorities. The situation affected all areas of Uzbek society, and state-led systematic forced labor in cotton industry seemed to last a lifetime. The population had already gotten used to this system that had been going on 4 years, and forced labor in cotton picking had become a habit for them. Mass media and propaganda reinforced the notion that they were contributing to the welfare of the state. Slogans such as "the cotton is our wealth" or "the cotton is our national value" were instilled in the minds of the people so that they stopped questioning the legality of the system or defending their rights. There were no reports on the consequences of the child labor or the forced labor, some of which result in deaths in the cotton fields. Young girls became the victims of the violence. Many children were poisoned by the chemicals. That serious health problems were observed. 10 years ago, when I received an offer to work with the Uzbek Forum, I had just graduated from the university and started teaching at the school. Since I was 20 years old, that is a school pupil, then the university student, and then school teacher, I had to participate in the cotton harvest every year in autumn. And not only but everyone I know was extremely dissatisfied with this system. Since my mother also was the farmer, I remembered very well that the farmers were sitting in the meetings at night in the local authority called Hakimiyat and in the cotton fields during the day, and the rights of the farmers were violated openly. Even once my mother was imprisoned for a day because she didn't fulfill the state cotton plan. It's very painful to remember those days and the suffering of the farmers. But there was no one to listen to our complaint, and people were even afraid to speak, to talk about the problems openly. And activists who raised the certain issues would face the severe harassment pressures from the authorities. The Uzbek people needed the a courageous organization that would actively highlight the situation of human rights violations in the country and raise the public awareness of these problems. Uzbek Forum has done just that. They established contact with independent activists and journalists operating in different regions of Uzbekistan and formed a reliable team. They organized trainings for activists on national and international standards on labor law so that they could become labor rights monitors. One of the main achievements was that the monitors of the Uzbek Forum were composed of local journalists and activists, because ordinary people, the residents of the village, did not want to speak or they give interviews on problems to strangers due to fear or the pressures or the harassment. And since the monitors were local activists, the people knew them well and didn't hesitate to tell them about the problems. Otherwise, it would be difficult to get the reliable information. This monitoring approach of the Uzbek Forum gave expected results, and an interview with the victims of forced labor was achieved and confidentiality of the respondents was ensured. The monitors managed to interview hundreds of the victims of child and forced labor in the cotton fields every year in the fall. On the basis of these facts and information, that through advocacy with the cotton campaign, awareness about these problems was raised at the national and international level, and influence mechanisms were developed to eliminate them. As a result, after the change of president in 2016, the serious changes began in Uzbekistan, and President Mirziyoyev demonstrated his political will to eliminate forced labor in cotton fields. Gradually, the number of victims of forced labor in the cotton fields decreased, and this was also noted in the reports of the Uzbek Forum. In my opinion, it's very important to continue the efforts of the Uzbek Forum and the cotton campaign to ensure the protects of the labor rights in agriculture sector. And I hope that the reforms started by the president of Uzbekistan will continue in all sectors, and ordinary people could feel the results of the liberal reforms. Thank you.
Thank you, Gulnaz. This really gives us an insight into how crucial the Uzbek Forum has been in building up the capacity of monitors and activists such as yourself. So we hope this continues, Amita, no pressure. And now if we can turn to Julie Hughes, who's the president of the U.S. Fashion Industry Association. And I will continue to ask leading questions if I can. So, Julie, why was it important for brands to become involved in the cotton campaign? How has that thinking evolved or changed over the years? How has the interaction and relationship changed? And since you are going last, we'll ask you the difficult question, which is, with the landmark success of ending state-imposed forced labor, what are the next steps? Where do we go from here, and how do we keep pushing for even greater successes?
No pressure. Okay. First I want to start and say, because I don't think we say it often enough, the thanks that we owe to civil society in Uzbekistan, to the activists, to the monitors who bring to us the stories and helped us see what was happening on the ground, because that is so important. And it certainly helped, I think, to maintain strong support and the motivation for those of us on the business side to support the cotton campaign and to continue our engagement with the cotton campaign. So, that's the essence. And that helped to create and to drive companies to sign the pledge. As Patricia said and Bennett said, signing a pledge, there was a lot of, uncertainty and questions from brands and retailers, and certainly from, their legal teams on, what does it mean? But the egregious situation on the ground in Uzbekistan meant that, we ended up with more than 300 companies that had signed. And it meant that for business associations, that we had the support from our members to maintain our engagement and to be in lockstep, to go to the meetings with Cotton Campaign and to raise our voices to say, no, this is not just the NGOs, this is not just civil society, this is not just labor groups, this is business. We are unified in this effort, and we are in for the long haul, because it certainly took a while, to eliminate systemic forced labor on the ground. So, I mean, I think, you ask, like, why, I know people may not say this often enough, but, the support from the business community and the belief that we need to eliminate forced labor in all of its forms, and this was pretty clear, systemic forced labor that was state-sponsored. I don't think we did not get a lot of pushback for remaining engaged. I mean, we can tell stories over drinks of, how many times there was pressure saying, oh, come on, lift the pledge, things are better, we're making progress. And we supported all along the way what the Cotton Campaign did to say, no, we need to hear the reports, we need to hear from Amita and the team on the ground that really there is not systemic forced labor. There's a lot of other things I could say, but let me go to the last question first. So, kind of what is next? And we're celebrating the achievement today, and I don't want to shorten that. Like we're celebrating an accomplishment that took many years and commitment from many people, some in this room and some not in this room. But what comes next? This is not the end. There are still other pillars of what the Cotton Campaign has recommended on the ground in Uzbekistan for, making sure that civil society is heard, that the worker voice is heard, that there are independent unions, that there is that opportunity to not backslide, to have, maybe it's not systemic state-sponsored forced labor, but to have forced labor of any kind. And I think that's what we're looking for next. So that's not necessarily a pledge, but there's a commitment from brands and retailers to maintain our support and engagement with Cotton Campaign. And we look forward to being involved in the next steps, but also to celebrating today the accomplishments that we've had. So I thank you for the chance to join the panel and share that perspective that business is here with the Cotton Campaign together. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Julie. And now we have about 10 minutes for questions from the audience. Please raise your hand, and Jeff will come to you with a microphone. Right there, Jeff. And please introduce yourself. And if you have a specific question for our panelists, just let them know.
The list of firms that have taken the pledge don't necessarily accord with the list of firms that have sourced Chinese cotton. And in that case, the control is coming more from the federal government top down rather than from the companies themselves. But clearly, there's a bit of Swiss cheese here. And I'm wondering if the industry is in fact pretty fungible, that when you succeed in Uzbekistan and Turkmenistan, hopefully, that the pressure increases to sneak Xinjiang cotton into approved channels.
I'm happy to respond to that on behalf of business, and I'm happy to let you on spot of cotton. Sorry to totally disagree. I think that for the brands and retailers that I know and work with, since the first reports came out of XUAR, they have cut their ties with the region and have been working hard to ensure that there is not Xinjiang cotton in their supply chains. You're right that cotton as a product tends to be fungible, and there are practices in the industry that have mixed them, but it's not a case for businesses of saying, all right, we've shut this down here, but we're going to take a blind eye on what's happening from Xinjiang. I will also say we supported the Uyghur Forced Labor Prevention Act when Congress considered it and support the implementation and enforcement of it because there should be no forced labor in the supply chain.
Sébastien Pérouse, I'm the director of the Central Asia Program, GW. I have a question on the mechanization of agriculture in Turkmenistan, Uzbekistan. Where are we now? Do you have any information on what part of cotton now is being picked up by machines? And second, what is your approach actually on mechanization? Do you support it? Is it part of your campaign? And to what extent do you consider that this is helping to prevent forced labor in the cotton fields in Turkmenistan and Uzbekistan? Thank you.
Next panel, I think. Unless you-
Well, I can speak to mechanization. Yeah. I've been in the fields. I've seen them roll a couple machines by. They like to really talk about mechanization, but whether it's actually really happening or not, or what the challenges are to it or not, is another story. Because using mechanized harvesters, you need actually different types of gins then to process that cotton. How they plant it, the rows need to be a certain distance apart. And we heard stories of a Hokimiyat saying, they need to be planted closer together. We have to get more cotton into the field, right, for the higher yield. And then the machines couldn't actually go through and pick it properly. So, there's a lot around mechanization that needs to happen. Plus, we want there to be jobs. The wages have gone up quite a lot in the last couple of years, which has been great because now the pickers actually can earn more money. So that's, also very advantageous. And it's going to be spotty how this all kind of comes together. I do think that that there is an advantage to having mechanization in the really low populated areas, because otherwise you're having to move a lot of people, right? And so there you're not actually replacing workers necessarily. Machines could play a positive role there. I don't know, Gulnaz, if you have any comment about using the big machines to harvest, whether you see it as a good thing or a bad thing.
Some farmers says that this is not so good because it can be affect the quality of the cotton, so that the farmers somehow disagree using this kind of machines, harvest machines. Thank you.
We have time for 2 more questions. We have Navahor and then Kathy, please.
Well, thank you so much for this discussion. Really appreciate it. And I feel sort of ancient listening to all of you because I remember how it all started and how we used to have these discussions in Washington, and we used to get zero response from the Uzbek government whenever we raised forced labor, child labor related issues. And for a while, we saw a very vibrant discussion in Uzbekistan, which seemed quite a progress. And I want to specifically mention 2018 and 2019. We don't hear any of these discussions now. And we've been observing, backsliding in so many sectors in the country now. And there is a concern that when I talk to the activists in Uzbekistan, that the Uzbek government pretty much thinks that this is a done deal. We'll resolve this issue, next, right? And whatever happens from now on will just be organic, and we'll just, work with them as we like. Who are your counterparts now in the Uzbek government? Who are your people there who are still pushing for this? And to what extent the Uzbek government has been living up to your expectations, to its own commitments since you ended the pledge? Because you then launched the next phase of this, right, of this fight. So how do you assess the government's performance so far? My question is to all of you, and Bennett.
It's a great question.
Thank you.
And I'll take a quick first crack at it. First, I'll make a pretty positive observation and then a less positive one. On the positive side, there is a new generation post-Karimov of modernizers and reformers at high levels of the government, some in cabinet posts, with whom we've engaged intensively in 2018, 19, early 2020, and then again when we were there last March. These are people mostly educated abroad who have a vision of a reforming Uzbekistan that's really part of the global economy. It's hard to pin them down about their understanding of how, at least in our view, that being fully integrated in the global economy means respecting international labor and human rights standards, not just as a proposition around values, but to attract the kinds of brands, apparel, and others to source and invest and so forth. But there is a group there that we've engaged with. Our engagement has been up to the cabinet level, trade and investment, agriculture, labor, Deputy Prime Minister, the President of the Senate at the highest level, who's number 2 in the Constitution there, Madam Narbayeva. So the window really opened for reform, not just so much when President Karimov died, but when President Mirziyoyev made that speech, the 2 speeches, New York and Tashkent, in September of 2017, committing to reform. On the less positive side, and frankly the discouraging side, is that momentum for reform, as you observe in your question, seems to have dissipated. We hope not entirely. And the expectation, the opportunity created by the end of state-imposed forced labor, the lifting of the pledge, the boycott, should be an enabler of further reform, further modernization, but of foreign investment. But what we want is foreign investment by brands that are committed to the ILO core labor standards, UN guiding principles on business and human rights, and so forth. The ball is in the court of the government to take further tangible steps to create the enabling environment for further progress on labor rights and human rights necessary to attract the Julie's members and other global brands in Europe that actually adhere to global standards and will feel the arm of law enforcement from their home country governments and stakeholders and shareholders if they don't. So the Uzbek government needs to get back on the reform wagon here and drive forward and, frankly, not blow an historic opportunity that they help create for themselves by ending, albeit with pressure and engagement from us, especially our civil society colleagues on the ground, to end state-imposed forced labor. They need to go further now. We're in the 3rd decade of the 21st century. There are global standards, and if they're serious about creating jobs and economic opportunity, but they have to make the choice. Keep the screws on for a repressive regime or open up a little more to allow this young country grow, thrive, and prosper.
Thank you, Bennett. We're at time, but I know Kathy had a very quick question. I saw a couple of other questions. Please keep in mind that there is a reception after the second panel, so you're more than welcome to stay and network and ask further questions at that time. Thank you.
Kathy Kosman, as one who was involved in early efforts to help organize oil workers in Kazakhstan for real trade unions, I totally congratulate you on your success. My question is, how much of the businesses involved in this effort are from non-US countries?
Patricia could probably answer that because she'll know the names of everyone, but I think it's a very good mix of US and European brands.
Yeah, there's also, Canadian, Japanese, and European. I think that's probably it, yeah.
Thank you very much to our panelists. We appreciate your comments. And we will soon after turn it over to Raluca after a short 10-minute break between the two panels. Thank you very much.
Okay, so very quickly, to introduce myself, I'm Raluca Dumitrescu, and I'm the coordinator of the Cotton Campaign, and I'm very pleased with the opportunity to moderate this panel, and it's really a great pleasure to see how many of you are joining us for this important discussion. So panel one explored how the Cotton Campaign, as a concentrated and coordinated effort by NGOs, unions, brand associations, and investors, pushed for systemic change in Uzbekistan, leading to the end of state-imposed forced labor in cotton. And now, against that background, on this panel, I would like to explore where the work of the Cotton Campaign sits in the global context for supply chain governance and how coalition building more broadly can help bring an end to forced labor in cotton supply chains and advance democracy and freedom of association rights for cotton workers. So I'm really delighted to introduce you to our distinguished panelists who will help navigate some of these questions. So first we have Jawhar Ilham, Forced Labor Project Coordinator at Worker Rights Consortium. She's an author, rights activist, and a steering committee member and a spokesperson for the End Uyghur Forced Labor Coalition. Then we have to the left Ruslan Miyatiev. He is the director of Turkmen News, which is an independent human rights and news platform which exposes abuses in Turkmenistan, which remains one of the most closed and repressive countries in the world. And Turkmen News has been a core partner of the Cotton Campaign for over 10 years now. Then we have Umida Niyazova, who is the director of Uzbek Forum for Human Rights. You already heard about the work, the transformative work that Uzbek Forum has been doing in Uzbekistan, who for 13 years now have been monitoring the cotton harvest and also training and strengthening the network of forced labor monitors. And finally, we have Alison Gill. She's the Forced Labor Program Director at GLJ ILRF, and she's also a steering committee member of the Cotton Campaign. And actually a steering committee member of both coalitions. If I realize now my remarks aren't entirely correct, she's both on the steering committee of both the End Uyghur Forced Labor Coalition and the Cotton Campaign. And she has a deep experience in both human rights work in Central Asia and coalition building and advocacy strategies to increase accountability for both governments and companies for abuses taking place in supply chain. But let's start to make sure that we make the most of the limited time we have, and hopefully we'll make it with 10 minutes at the end for Q&A. So first, Jawhar. You know, in the last decade or so, we heard a lot about state-imposed forced labor in Uzbekistan and Turkmenistan, and now there's increasingly more attention to Uyghur forced labor as well. Can you tell us a bit more about this? What exactly is Uyghur forced labor, and how is it connected to global supply chains?
That's a great question to start. Uyghur forced labor is also state-sponsored, and it's also systematic. It intersects with other types of egregious human rights abuses, including undermining the Uyghur culture and customs, and political indoctrination, pervasive surveillance, and also family separation, gender-based violence and harassment, and forced sterilization. And these abuses also include arbitrary mass detention of an estimated about 1 to 1.8 million people, and a program to cleanse ethnic groups and of their extremist thoughts through eradication and forced labor, and which also this involves both detainees. Detained labor inside internment camps, and also multiple forms of involuntary labor at workplaces across the region, even outside of the Uyghur region and mainland city in China. And to be fair, if I were in China now, I wouldn't be able to sit here in front of you with my headscarf on. or fasting during the holy month of Ramadan, which is now, I would probably have been sent to a detention facility, just like my cousin or my father or my uncles. Just as background information, I normally don't wear a headscarf, but because of my family members' inability to worship or practice our religion, I feel like the need to practice it in any ways I can in a land where I can find my own freedom. So how, to the question, second part of the question, how is the Uyghur forced labor connected to the global supply chain? So we learned that many of you all are aware, 84% of the cotton from China is produced in the Uyghur region, and that is about 20% of the global cotton output. And 45% of the solar-grade polysilicon is also world's 45% of it. It's from the Uyghur region as well. And also we know that 12% of the world's supply of primary aluminum and 10% of the world's PVC, which is used for the luxury flooring, the vinyl floorings, they're all produced in my homeland. And which means that the supply chain of a huge number of corporations that sell products in the US or other countries around the world run through a region that is the global epicenter of state-imposed forced labor on a massive scale. And it's essential that all companies fully trace their supply chains to identify any potential threats of potential connections of state-sponsored forced labor. So the conditions in my homeland, the Uyghur region, make it impossible for any meaningful corporate due diligence, as I mentioned, because of the intense level of surveillance. Just a side note, my cousin was actually arrested in one of the checkpoints located randomly on the streets in my hometown. She was asked to stop and deposit her phone. She was later sentenced to 10 years for not coordinating with the police and for having a photo of my father in her cell phone. So because of this, the coalition to end Uyghur forced labor has been calling on companies to fully exit the Uyghur region at every level of their supply chain. And we're urging companies in all sectors to adopt a single global standard in line with the requirements of the Uyghur Forced Labor Prevention Act, so that no other markets becoming a dumping ground for goods made with Uyghur forced labor. And we encourage all companies to take immediate steps to trace their supply chains and address any connections to Uyghur forced labor, and not wait for a regulation to be enforced.
Thanks.
Thank you.
So you mentioned a bit the demand, right, of the End Uyghur Forced Labor Coalition, calling on companies to exit the Uyghur region and calling more broadly for transparency and traceability. Can you speak a bit about the gains of the coalition? What have you achieved? And actually, I don't think you mentioned when have these groups come together as a coalition, and who are the groups? I realize we need to take a step back.
Yes, of course, yes. We have created a broad-based coalition about 3 years ago, and within 3 years, we now have over 60 members and over 415 endorsers from more than 44 countries around the world. Amazing numbers. And also 14 organizations on the steering committee, including Worker Rights Consortium, where I'm working at, and also AFL-CIO and Uyghur organizations like Uyghur Human Rights Project and GLJ-ILRF, and many more. I'm not going to name all 14 groups, but the coalition has been very effective at getting media attention to documented violations of Uyghur forced labor, and making forced labor a focal point of public debate, and at getting commitments from major corporations. So The coalition's call to action demands companies to exit the Uyghur region at every level of their supply chain is now effectively codified in the Uyghur Forced Labor Prevention Act. So that's one of the first wins, I would say. And the Uyghur Forced Labor Prevention Act enforcement has also targeted and detained shipments across multiple sectors, from apparel to solar to aluminum to fruits, like a few of those highly at-risk sectors. And brands in at least some sectors have been asked to provide an unprecedented level of supply chain disclosure. And suppliers are also facing an unprecedented level of scrutiny. Many, although by no means all, major apparel brands have exited or are exiting the Uyghur region, just like earlier Ms. Julie, who you have mentioned. And I hope I didn't butcher your name. And also, we have learned from reports that demands for Xinjiang cotton is also declining. Multiple other countries, another one is that multiple other countries are now also considering legislations that would address imports of goods made with Uyghur forced labor, like Canada and also some and EU as well. And forced labor is an issue that has brought people together across countries and cross sectors, because this is something that we are all involved in, because no matter we're working in labor rights or not, we're all consumers. And the coalition steering committee brings 5 leading Uyghur rights groups together, given the impossibility of affected people living in my homeland being able to speak out. It's been so important to have Uyghurs living outside the region to join and help lead this broad coalition, and working together with many human rights and labor rights groups that have deep knowledge of supply chains and expertise in corporate accountability.
Thanks really, really much. I mean, that's such great impact, and it's really extremely important achievements, legal achievements, actually, in our fight against forced labor, because we know achieving this type of legal change sometimes is one of the most difficult things. And it's going to help us so much more in the future, just raising the standard and creating a level playing field when we call on companies to continue mapping, tracing, mapping their supply chains down to the raw material and tracing where the cotton comes from, and eliminating cotton made with state-imposed forced labor. So I'll get back to this bit on the achievements in a moment. But as we move to the second panelist, I want to inform everyone here that actually, there's another context linked to global supply chains where similarly to what we're seeing in the Uyghur region, there is state-imposed forced labor in cotton harvest, and that context is Turkmenistan. So I'd invite Ruslan if he can give us a bit more details and bring everyone up to speed to the situation that we're seeing in Turkmen cotton.
Thank you very much. Thanks for coming, everybody. The latest developments with the laws and legal reforms everywhere in the world related to the Uyghur forced labor problem gives us hope. We're trying to squeeze a small country of Turkmenistan into that and yell at every corner possible that, look, we have the same problem in the textile industry, in the cotton industry in general, and the textile industry in particular. The situation in Turkmenistan is bad. Every year, and we have been doing this monitoring with the cotton campaign for the past 10 years, since 2013. Every year we have tens of thousands of civil servants in Turkmenistan who are forced to pick cotton. They have to do so under different threats, including salary cuts or termination of employment. And as in the first panel was said, the people are desperate. In Turkmenistan, it's the same situation. So in Uzbekistan, the feelings among the people that led, to the building of this coalition and this work in general, the same we're seeing in Turkmenistan. That's the reason that despite all risks, and the risks are very high in Turkmenistan, we have seen activists being imprisoned for sending us reports, photographs, or even videos from the cotton fields. Despite all of those risks, they still have hopes, and they believe in us. They see successes in Uzbekistan, and I personally hope that one day or another we will be celebrating the same victory, perhaps in this room. As the General Secretary of IUF said in her intro, wishing 15 more years for the cotton campaign. Well, I'm happy to stay for that long, but I hope that changes will come sooner than that.
Would you like to maybe give us a bit more detail? And here I want to pick up on the point that Joar made earlier in terms of the gains politically and legally that the End Uyghur Forced Labor Coalition has made recently, and the gains that we as the Cotton Campaign have achieved in Uzbekistan. How do you think we can build on that to increase even more, the economic and the political pressure on the government of Turkmenistan?
Even though the two countries, Uzbekistan and Turkmenistan, are so close to each other, they are neighbors. And even though they were, I should say probably past tense, were run by autocrats, they were still different. The decision-making process in Turkmenistan is completely different than what we see in Turkmenistan. Important things, the political will, we don't have that in Turkmenistan. In the previous panels, I quoted two Turkmen government officials who spoke, who presented at the UN last month. They don't recognize the problem. They don't see it a problem. Going back to Sebastian's concern about mechanization, that is what they use. That is what they tell us. Well, we have 1,600 harvesters. We don't have that problem, but that's not the solution. They are not going to eradicate the problem of manual harvesting. As I said in the first part, when I answered the first question, there is hope. We believe that things are possible. I mean, who could have imagined that this event would have been taking place today? Maybe 5, 7 or 10 years ago. I mean, in a situation that seemed to be so hopeless. Now we're discussing, now our activists, colleagues from Uzbekistan are traveling to the country, This is something I think 10 years ago would not be imaginable. So we have the hope. It is just a matter of being stronger, speaking out loud, joining forces on all sides, human rights organizations, apparel brands, economic pressure. Indeed, even though the government does not recognize us, they don't see us as a force, our activities, what we do, affects them. Because even though we don't have 331 brands who signed the Cotton Pledge, we have maybe half of that, they still feel it. They still feel it because, we can judge that by how many jeans or towels that they threw on local Turkmen markets and sold, like towels or jeans bearing big names, and sold them for pennies for the local consumers. The things that were supposed to go to New York or Amsterdam or Berlin were sold in Turkmen bazaars. This is slowly, we're getting there. We need to be stronger and be together. That is the solution, I believe.
On that note, hopeful and stay with us, and it can happen here as well. I'd like to move to our third panelist, Umida Niyazova from Uzbek Forum for Human Rights. We've talked about Uzbekistan, how winning looks like there, very great achievement we are all recognizing and applauding. But at the same time, it has already been alluded, I think, on the first panel that our work is not finished, and our cotton campaign steering committee members kept talking about, we're entering a new phase. What exactly is the new phase? So, Umida, maybe you can give us a bit more detail about the context, the landscape we're navigating now in Uzbekistan. We are already 1 year after the end of state-imposed forced labor, 1 year after we lifted the pledge. How do things look like there on the ground now?
Yes, thank you, Raluca, and thank you for the opportunity to present our findings from the cotton monitoring 2022. And I was telling Ruslan that I was very, very hopeless when I left Uzbekistan 14 years ago after spending 4 months in prison. And it was just very dark time, so the regime was so repressive that you couldn't believe that it is possible to improve it. And it is true that we saw that the situation in the cotton sector with the forced labor and child labor of cotton pickers changed dramatically. And I was able to go to Uzbekistan, actually, to see my family after living 13 years in exile without possibility to go to Uzbekistan. Uzbek Forum works with a network of independent human rights activists who conduct monitoring inside Uzbekistan. We monitor on labor rights in agriculture, particularly in the cotton and also silk sector. We also conduct research into problems of farmland confiscation and exploitative relation between corporations and farmers. Although the Cotton Campaign Coalition announced last year that it was no longer calling for a boycott of Uzbek cotton, we continued our monitoring because the forced labor of cotton pickers was not the only human rights violations of Uzbekistan's cotton sector. When Uzbek Forum started monitoring 12 years ago, the cotton sector was state-owned. Cotton production quotas were set by state, and farmers were obliged to meet these quotas and hand over entire crop to the state, which also set the price for cotton. Following the privatization of the cotton sector beginning in 2018, all cotton is now processed inside Uzbekistan and sold in the form of yarn and finished garments. The privatization process saw the establishment of so-called cotton clusters, so vertically integrated companies that produce and process cotton and manufacture finished goods in a closed supply chain. The export of raw cotton today is prohibited, and state-set quotas, one of the key drivers of forced labor, had been abolished. So last year, approximately 2 million people were involved in picking cotton during the 2 months, October and November. During 2022 cotton harvest, Uzbek Forum monitors found no evidence of systematic government-imposed forced labor for the second consecutive year, which is good. We found isolated incidents of forced labor and extortion to pay for the cotton harvest in some districts with low populations and insufficient numbers of pickers. There were questions about machinery, and in some districts, mechanization could also help to solve the problem. Instances of coercion to pick cotton intensified in the second half of October, when the amount of cotton in the fields decreased and pickers were therefore able to earn less. And the main reason that pushed some district leaders to give orders to send employees of state organizations to pick cotton is the continued centralized control over cotton picking process by government officials. Farmers and their workers are in a very vulnerable position vis-à-vis cotton clusters for which they have to grow cotton. They were forced to sign blank contract without a guaranteed minimum price, and most farmers didn't have a copy of this contract. And local authorities continue to illustrate illegal land confiscations. Land can be arbitrarily taken away at any time. So the most common practice of taking land from farmers is for local officials to pressure them into writing a statement of so-called voluntarily termination of land lease agreement. So you can read more about the situation of farmers and the remaining risks of rights violations in our report, which we published recently on our website. Thank you.
Thanks, Umida. And now that you've mentioned this new set of human and labor rights that are emerging in this context when the government ended state-imposed forced labor, but we're seeing other types of labor violations, I think, it's becoming very clear why the continuation of the work you do and the work that Uzbek Forum does is really critical to our collective work now. So not just to monitor and document violations, but obviously to amplify the voices of the Uzbek cotton workers and farmers, and to continue training labor monitors and human rights activists in Uzbekistan. And Alison, finally, I'd like to turn this to you. Like I said, you're a steering committee member of both the Cotton Campaign and the End Uyghur Forced Labor coalitions. Big question. How do we leverage the gains made so far in the space of supply chain governance to expand the space and push further for worker and labor rights in Uzbek cotton?
Thanks, Raluca, and thanks to my colleagues on the panel, without whom none of this work would be possible. I want to recall, to those of you who are old-timers, you'll remember this, that as the situation in Uzbekistan began to change, the Cotton Campaign actually defined what success would look like. And so we defined 3 pillars of success, and they were ending systemic forced labor, enacting structural reforms that would include granting further autonomy to farmers, and empowering civil society to ensure an enabling environment for labor rights. And actually, at the request of the Uzbek government at the time, this is about 2019, we drafted a detailed roadmap defining key elements of each of those pillars, which we delivered in about mid-2019. And we're here today to acknowledge and celebrate the landmark success on the first pillar. A year ago, after Uzbek Forum found no systemic forced labor, we lifted our call for a boycott. But as you've heard from Umida, lack of progress on the other 2 pillars is threatening the sustainability of those reforms. And one of the problems was a very narrow technical definition of forced labor, a definition of forced labor that was stripped of other fundamental labor rights, including, crucially, the rights to freedom of association, the right to organize and collectively bargain. And we know, as JJ said in her opening, that independent trade unions have a key role to play in sustaining reforms to end forced labor and make a transition to decent work. And this is especially true as Uzbekistan transitions to private systems of cotton production. Forced labor exists as the most egregious form of a range of a spectrum of exploitative practices. It's not static. Conditions can fall in and out of forced labor, and the best protection against forced labor is freedom of association. Where workers have agency over their own conditions and the means to defend them, we know that they are less likely to be in forced labor. And this connects to Navbahor's question after the first panel. What can we do to re-energize the Uzbek government on this path? And I think that is to really tie what is next to the emerging movement for increased global supply chain governance that Jawher talked about in her remarks as well. So the 3 pillars actually remain the goal for Uzbekistan, and not just for Uzbekistan, but also for Turkmenistan, and I would argue for the Uyghur region, where the fight for these rights is truly existential for the Uyghur people. So it's easy to get lost sometimes in the thick of a campaign we're not just seeking company disengagement for the heck of it. We're not anti-China. We are not trying to get a particular law passed. We are literally fighting for the enabling rights that allow people to defend their own rights and have agency over their own conditions. So I think that very much remains our work ahead. And how to do that is, I think, to look very carefully at how the world has changed in the 15 years since we've been doing this work and leverage these movements. Jawhar talked about the Uyghur Forced Labor Protection Act, which is the strongest forced labor import ban anywhere. And it has really required companies to take a deep look into their supply chains down to the raw material level. That obligation should hold true not just for products produced in the Uyghur region or by Uyghur forced labor, but also in Turkmenistan. And we are making that call very publicly. There is a slate of laws on due diligence requiring companies to take real meaningful action to identify, to mitigate, to remediate human rights risks in their supply chains. Those laws are started as sort of guiding principles and sort of flexible standards, and now they're being enshrined in some cases in real legislation. And there is also an emerging understanding that this is not just good for workers, but good for business, that businesses have a vested interest in ensuring that they can source responsibly. I think we all saw what happened when businesses became alert to the human rights risks embedded in their Chinese supply chains, or particularly their Uyghur region supply chains. And I don't think anybody wants to be in that situation again. So just to be quite specific, where we are now, as we've heard from Jawhar and Ruslan, on Turkmenistan, companies cannot be sourcing cotton from Turkmenistan. They need to look into their supply chains and really understand if they have exposure to Turkmen cotton, as we know that they do from having done supply chain research. In the Uyghur region, it's the same. They need to understand absolutely to the raw material levels where their rights risks are and disengage. And we have strong import legislation in the US, and we hope to see it adopted similarly in EU countries and in other jurisdictions, so that companies cannot sell these products that are produced with forced labor. And in Uzbekistan, where I'm going to sound a moment of hope, despite the fact that we haven't made a lot of progress, or the Uzbek government hasn't made a lot of progress on the second two pillars, we have an opportunity to test new approaches, to test approaches that we've seen work in other places, particularly in the garment sector, where many of those of you in this room have a lot of experience and understand what the labor dynamics are in garment supply chains. And so some of these approaches are approaches that require buyers to use their commercial leverage to ensure that human rights are upheld in their supply chains, and that workers in those supply chains have control over those conditions. So those are robust monitoring mechanisms, grievance mechanisms, as well as mechanisms to ensure that labor disputes are resolved at the workplace level and don't result in forced labor conditions. Just last point on that is that these new approaches also, interestingly, require buyers to commit to not using their combined leverage to drive standards down and to drive prices down. And we've seen that the Uzbek industry, the emerging textile industry, is really interested in this. They're really interested in in selling to the global market, but in not having the global market come in and push down their standards. So I think there's a lot of reason to hope that we can find and test solutions that are good for workers, good for Uzbek suppliers, and good for international business. We're prepared to do that. We know how to do that, and this is work we're all excited about. And just to close, Bennett talked about the broad and diverse coalition that we are. And I want to say that this coalition has made ambitious demands, and we didn't win what we won by aiming low. We won what we won by aiming high, and everybody in this room and many people around the world can take some credit for that. So we've been willing to be flexible in our approach, but not in our demands. And I think I just want to end with that thought. Sometimes the fight seems hard, but we can win them.
So I know that we're running a bit late, but I'd like to take one or two questions from the audience, if there are any. Okay. Okay. So please be mindful, we're going to host a reception after the end of this panel. And of course, everyone's welcome to engage with our panelists and learn more about the work. Okay, I see 2 hands there. Please go ahead.
So we'll start with these.
We're stacking.
Hi. I'm looking at it from a consumer perspective. When I go to a retail store, let's say Target or maybe on Amazon, right? I have no clue where the cotton comes from. I may see made in China, made in Bangladesh, made in India, or made in some other country, right? Well, technology is available to track it if companies decide to go for supply chain tracking, where the cotton was produced, where it was processed, where a pair of jeans was actually manufactured. If they really want to do it, it could be tracked. So as a customer, what can I do in the US when I'm dealing with a retail store or Amazon?
Yeah, thank you so much. I just felt also trying to join others in congratulating you on the great achievement. I know is not always easy, but really congratulations on the great work done. I appreciate also the efforts that was made by the Uzbek government. However, I'm wondering if someone can tell me how transformative this accomplishment is. A couple years ago, the United Nations Committee Against Torture did a mission in Uzbekistan and find widespread use of torture and ill treatment in Uzbekistan. So the question is, how transformative is these steps that we have seen in order to affect other sectors to make sure that this achievement can help transform some of these issues in Uzbekistan? Thank you.
Alison, maybe you wanna take a crack at the first question? So it was related to what can consumers do to really know where the cotton comes from?
My answer to that, your very good question, I mean, it's a concern that I share, is that consumers shouldn't have to. We're busy people. I have kids. It's really hard to find time to do things, let alone to research the entire multinational supply chain of a T-shirt that you're going to buy. I think consumers shouldn't have to know this. I think standards should be high, and we should expect that companies are upholding these standards, and that the obligation is actually not on you. You should vote. You should vote your wallet and vote your actual vote to vote for strong laws and strong policies that would ensure that there is no forced labor in supply chains. But I think to answer what you actually wanted to know, which is there anything you can do now? Some companies are doing more traceability in their supply chains. I think we've seen a lot of exciting new technology that actually allows companies to track. I think that's all very good, and it needs to incorporate labor standards. So just knowing where physically something was produced doesn't give you the full information. And there's a lot of work that needs to be done around how those labor standards are evaluated and understood. Who is collecting the information? With any kind of technology solution, it's my sister here, Abby McGill, always says, it's garbage in and garbage out. If you put bad information into a tracking system, you're not going to learn anything useful. So I think we're starting to get there, and we're not there yet. And so vote.
And Umida, maybe you want to take on the second question, which I think it was related to how can we use this win and these reforms that we're seeing to end state-imposed forced labor in cotton to push for changes or reforms in other areas, in other human rights areas in Uzbekistan?
I don't know. It's a very difficult question. Today for instance, we received the bad news that the friend of mine, the filmmaker, journalist who was based in London, she was prevented from entering Uzbekistan without any explanation. So this case, I think, vividly demonstrates where Uzbekistan is today. So the reforms sometimes it looks like they are backsliding, and Uzbekistan claims to be on the path of reforms, liberal reform, but it's never clear whether these statements and promises are reliable. And so sustainability is a very, very big question, and nobody can say, I think, that if maybe there will be time that Uzbekistan will return to authoritarianism that we saw during the Karimov regime. But today, I'm actually hopeful that we have, as Bennett said, that we have some leadership in the Uzbek government, the young, modern people who studied abroad. And it seems that they understand that it is better for Uzbek economy and for Uzbekistan to open the country. Thank you.
Thanks. Thanks to our panelists. Unfortunately, we need to stop here. Big round of applause. Yeah, I did it. And now, very quickly, I'd like to introduce our next speaker who will provide closing remarks for our event, Kelly M. Fay Rodriguez, a strong advocate for labor rights and freedom of association in global supply chains. And now she's doing this work in her role as Special Representative for International Labor Affairs Bureau of Democracy, Human Rights, and Labor at the Department of State. Please.
Hi, everyone. I'll be brief. There's not a whole lot to add. I mean, the last two panels have been just truly inspiring. I just feel really lucky to get to be a part of celebrating the progress, the hard work, the risk that so many of you have taken over the years to make change in Uzbekistan, in Turkmenistan, in China, and to really be clear about what's ahead and what more we need to be doing. But I just can't, I love the title of this. I mean, what does it look like for us to be winning? This is it, right? You all are it. I previously, before joining the State Department, actually today is my fourth month in this role. And before that, I was a council, oversight council on the Trade Subcommittee of House Ways and Means. And I remember in 2020, when USTR let us know that they were going to end the review of Uzbekistan for forced labor. And I remember the briefing, the debate, and sort of the conversation and reaching out, of course, to faithful allies in this room to verify, wait, is this right? Like, is this really, are we ready to take that step? You know, having those conversations, often focusing on the unfair trade practice element of forced labor, how it skews and really undermines our global economy and supply chains. You know, moving from there to this, to hear the real life impact over, you know, the previous panel and you all, of what it looks like to really transform cultural practices, to really create openings for a new way of living and working and existing in these societies. I mean, it's really inspiring. Really, really excited to think about what's next for freedom of association in Uzbekistan now and for trade unions. Really, I was moved to hear from Golnaz earlier about monitoring and describing the kinds of intimidation, harassment, and really persecution that she and others, her mother and others faced, and what happens when people resisted the demands to go into the fields during the harvest. Just inspired by the Uzbek Forum's work, collecting data, but being able to capture the stories of workers' experiences under such extreme opposition. I hope we can take that in. I certainly am. I want to share also, I've been in touch with the U.S. ambassador in Uzbekistan, Ambassador Henrik. He takes this. He knows this issue inside out. He takes it very seriously. He is committed to continuing to push the Uzbek government to do more. And we all, I mean, what actually is really so great about this space and this conversation is it's government. It takes all of us, right? It takes private sector business, business associations, companies, NGOs, trade unions. It really takes all of us to work together to be able to make these important changes. And I, in this role, I know Undersecretary Zaya at the State Department and our special representative for LGBTQI rights, Jessica Stern, actually met with the government of Uzbekistan yesterday to discuss a range of human rights issues, right? But it just really ties together how all of these rights are necessary. And we know often, in many cases, that the labor rights that you all are working for are the enabling ones that allow us to have these conversations about, in some cases, more challenging issues such as LGBTQ rights in some of these spaces. So you're opening the door for human rights defenders of all kinds to be able to make more progress and gain more ground. What is also clear from these conversations, and we discussed this a little bit yesterday, but there is really not one model that's going to fix any of these problems. And that's what's so great about this space is that we can conspire and really dream big and think about what else is possible. Part of what I see my job as is educating my colleagues across the government, across the State Department in particular, and at embassies abroad about all of the ways in which you all are finding new openings, new tools, new policy tools to advance labor rights, to strengthen labor rights, and to really help realize decent work in a lot of these places. We also know, and it's evident, that trade unions, worker centers, labor rights advocates definitely have to be a part of any meaningful, effective effort to do this. And so really grateful for the unions who have been involved from the start, IUF and others who we heard from earlier. It's just, this is really, it's an example of what we need to be doing more of. So we're here today because business, governments, and the global community should and needs to play a more proactive role in supporting labor rights and preventing forced labor in our global supply chains. I look forward to the next phase where we have all of you together again next year or whenever that comes, where we can celebrate achieving those next two goals that Allison referenced that are homework to meet to support workers and farmers and communities in Uzbekistan. So yeah, thank you so much for this. I'm really inspired by it. We'll take it with me, and I again look forward to the next steps. Thanks.